In 1992, Mr. Locke went through a bad divorce. He was 42 years old at the time and was frustrated. The 12-year marriage between him and his wife ended after he learned that she had cheated on him with a co-worker. The matter did not stop there, as Mr. Locke knew that his wife treated his only child badly and constantly threatened him that she would get full custody of him and would not let him meet his father again. Here, Mr. Locke felt betrayed twice. How could a woman do this to the man who loved her deeply and gave her everything she wanted in life? And if she did this to her husband, then how she could do this to her only child? Mr. Locke was not convinced by his wife's flimsy excuses, and at that time a very bad psychological state took hold of him, which made him decide to leave everything and go away. Mr. Locke waited until the divorce case was over, and he obtained the decision to take full custody of his son. And here he decided to look for another place to stay. He was feeling upset and sad, so he decided to get away from everything and to buy a simple hotel on Lake Mille Lacs. And then he resigned from his job, and he also decided to sell his house and go with his only son to their new home. Mr. Luke found that the hotel had a lot of problems that needed to be fixed, and then he and his son began setting an agenda to fix all of these problems. There were a lot of cracks in the walls, a lot of cracked walls, and also there were a lot of pieces of furniture that needed to be repaired and renewal, which is why Mr. Locke and his son immediately set to work. The process of repairing the hotel lasted 2 weeks, and when Mr. Locke finished all the repairs, he began to renovate the entrance and printed some advertisements announcing the hotel's services. Mr. Locke appointed a maid to clean the rooms and a receptionist to register customers, as well as 2 security guards, and began working in the hotel. Fortunately for Mr. Locke, the number of customers was constantly increasing, especially because Mr. Locke was keen to reduce room prices in the beginning so that he could compete with other existing hotels in the same area, which is why many families were keen to book at Mr. Luke's hotel and benefit from those discounts. The strange thing is that Mr. Luke began to notice that there were a lot of things missing from the hostel, especially forks, spoons, cups, and even ashtrays. Mr. Luke thought at first perhaps the disappearance of these things was due to the presence of thieves in the hotel, whether they were guests or hotel workers. But the strange thing is that those things that disappeared were reappearing again in other unusual places. It was worrying, of course, but at the same time it did not affect the guests staying inside the hotel, so Mr. Luke did not care much about doing anything. But as the days passed, loud noises began to appear out of nowhere, especially late at night. At first, the sounds were just simple knocking, and then it turned into something bigger. The knocking was very loud and annoying, and the annoying sounds continued for long periods of time, which bothered many hotel guests and made them leave. The matter did not stop there, but bad smells began to appear. Very bad smells that Mr. Locke did not know where they were coming from, but they became widespread in all the rooms in the hostel, and because of that smell and sounds, all the guests staying in the hostel left. It was very frustrating for Mr. Luke, especially after he discovered that the bad smell came from the carpets attached to the floors of the hostel. And here he and his son decided to remove those carpets from the floors, and while removing those carpets, the sounds began to rise again. They were so loud that Mr. Luke thought that the glass in hotel doors and windows will break due to the loud noise. Mr. Locke and his son finished removing all of the old carpeting in the inn, then installed new carpeting on all of the hotel's floors. Although the bad smell had passed, the sounds did not stop. The sounds were continuous all the time, continuing day and night, which put Mr. Luke and his son in a state of constant tension, and their psychological state began to get worse and worse. Work stopped completely, as everyone who came to book a room in the hotel knew, as soon as he arrived in the lake area, that that particular hotel was haunted, and that is why no one dared to book in the hotel. Rumors of the haunted hotel leaked to the press and television programs, and this is where most of the television stations and reporters started. In the newspapers regarding this strange incident, of course, the name and location of the hotel were announced, and they began to pursue former employees of the hotel, as well as to pursue all the guests who had previously stayed in the hotel, which made Mr. Locke feel more worried because he then realized that the hotel was gone forever. One day, Mr. Locke's sister came to visit him. Her name was Mrs. Bailey. She was a woman in her mid-30s, and she loved Mr. Locke and his son very much. Bailey did not know what was happening in the hotel at this time. Her visit to her brother and his son was a traditional visit to check on them, and she knew their conditions. but she was surprised by the bad condition of the hotel, and she felt the amount of frustration that Mr. Luke was suffering from, and here she decided to propose to him a very strange matter. Bailey suggested to Mr. Luke that he take advantage of everything that had been raised about the hotel and what had been shown on television and in newspapers and magazines to his advantage hostile, and to turn everything he considered negative propaganda into something positive. The basic idea was to advertise the hotel as being haunted, as there are many people looking for excitement and adventure who might want to book into the spooky haunted hotel. This is precisely what Mr. Locke did. He began printing more propaganda papers, but this time he mentioned in that propaganda some of what was happening in the hotel, whether from sounds or things disappearing or doors that opened and closed on their own. Only a few days later, guests began arriving again at the hotel, and indeed the hotel returned to work with strength. Mr. Luke's psychological state improved greatly because he felt that the hotel might succeed after the major changes that had occurred. The hotel operated normally for several months, and when Halloween approached, Mr. Luke decided to hold a special celebration for that occasion. He actually took advantage of the large hall in the hotel and decorated it with all the terrifying black and orange decorations that characterize Halloween, and he opened the doors of the hotel to receive anyone who wished to attend the party. The party was attended by many people from the area and tourists who pass by the lake at this time of the year. Among these attendees was a local woman. She was wearing a colorful dress and many rings of different sizes and shapes. Mr. Luke noticed that there were many attendees approaching her. They greet her with respect, and everyone is keen to talk to her for some time. She was special among the audience, and what caught Mr. Locke's attention to her the most was that she was looking everywhere in the hotel around her, as if she was examining something or seeing something that no one else could see. And here, Mr. Locke felt curious and decided to go talk to that lady. Mr. Locke approached the strange woman and greeted her and introduced himself as the new owner of the inn. Here, the lady greeted him warmly and told him that her name was Martina and that she had known this hotel since she was a little girl. Martina began to tell Mr. Locke about the hotel. Martina said that this hotel originally belonged to Mr. Archibald Grandison, who decided to build this hotel because his wife loved that lake, and at first it was only an ordinary house, not an inn, and one day Mrs. Archibald fell ill with tuberculosis, and it was difficult to treat it at that time, and despite all the doctor's attempts to treat Mrs. Archibald, she did not recover. Mrs. Archibald asked her husband to take her out of the hospital and bring her home. When Mrs. Archibald returned to her home, she only spent a few days and died because of her illness. Mr. Archibald grieved for his wife severely. Within months of her death, he also died, and it is said that the spirit of Mr. Archibald is still in the inn, which was witnessed by all the people who tried to buy the house and turn it into an inn. Every buyer who buys the hotel is exposed to many terrifying and strange phenomena. Martina confirmed that she does not even remember how many people bought this inn. Mr. Locke told her that he believed what happened with the old angels, and that he personally had many strange phenomena happen to him, for which there was no explanation. Martina nodded as if she knew that what Mr. Locke was saying was true and honest, and she replied to Mr. Locke that she knew this, as she also felt a lot of the wandering souls in this place. Mr. Luke looked at her in astonishment, not knowing what the meaning of what Miss Martina was saying. And he asked her what she meant, and she told him in a relatively low voice that she was a psychic and could feel things that ordinary people could not feel. Mr. Luke did not believe what Martina had just said, but he did not want to make her feel that way. While he was standing next to her, many people came to greet her and thank her for the help she had given them. Among these people was the maid working in the hotel, who thanked Mrs. Martina warmly. The party lasted for several hours, and then it ended and everyone went to their home, and the tourists each went to the place where they were staying. There was a lot of work after the party, so Mr. John, his son, and the rest of the hotel staff stayed to arrange everything after the attendees left, and after everyone finished the cleaning process, Mr. Luke suggested to have one last drink before they each went home as a compliment for their efforts. Everyone agreed without hesitation. Mr. Luke sat and talked about many things, including attending the party, and here he deliberately mentioned Martina and noticed that his employees at the hotel all knew her, especially the maid, who started talking about Mrs. Martina and how she helped her mother a lot, and the maid began to tell that her grandmother was a very old lady. At her age and in her final years, symptoms of Alzheimer's were clearly appearing on her, At that time, she completely refused to deal with her daughter, who was the maid's mother. Every time she tried to help her, talk to her, or offer her food, her grandmother would vehemently refuse. This continued for several months. The maid's mother felt very sad, and after several months, the grandmother died due to old age. Here, the maid's mother began to see many dreams in which she saw her mother running, and when she tried to catch up with her, she was unable to do so. This dream was repeated many times, to the point that her mother began to avoid sleep so as not to see this dream again. And here she asked Mrs. Martina to hold a summons session in order to talk to her mother and find out what was wrong with her. Indeed, Mrs. Martina came to the house and did that session and communicated with the spirit of the grandmother, who wanted to apologize to her daughter for what she suffered because of her in recent months. And since that session, the mother's dream has not repeated and she has been sleeping normally. Everyone started talking about the matter and confirming that Mrs. Martina had special abilities. And then the maid suggested that Mr. Luke ask Mrs. Martina to come to inspect the hotel and find out the secret of what was happening in it. Mr. Luke felt hesitant, but he did not want to explain the matter to the hotel staff, and then he told them that he would feel embarrassed to ask her this because he had not known her for a long time, so the maid volunteered to do the job. The next day, the hotel staff arrived and immediately began their work. The maid excused herself from Mr. Luke in the middle of the day for 1 hour. She left the inn and then returned to tell him that she had gone to Mrs. Martina and told her that Mr. Luke wanted to hold a meeting to find out the secret of what was happening in the inn. He asked her about Miss Martina's response, so she told him that she agreed, but that she would send him later the specific date for that session. A whole week passed before Mrs. Martina sent a little boy to Mr. Locke, telling him that Mrs. Martina would come today at 10 o'clock in the evening to do what he asked of her. And the boy told Mr. Locke that she wanted to see at least 3 people in the evening. Mr. Locke thought about the people who could attend, and then he asked the maid, the guard, and the receptionist to stay with him to attend the session. Everyone agreed without hesitation, and at 10 o'clock in the evening, Miss Martina arrived and asked Mr. Locke to hold the session in a closed room. Indeed, Mr. Locke, Mrs. Martina, the maid, the guard, and the receptionist went into one room and left Mr. Locke's son in the reception of the inn. Mrs. Martina asked for a round table, candles, and some bread. It seemed that the maid knew in advance that Mrs. Martina would ask for these things, and that is why she had prepared them from before. Mrs. Martina sat down and asked everyone to sit with her at the table. Each of them held the hand of the person sitting next to him and asked them to have one of them volunteer to be the carrier through whom the spirits would speak. The guard agreed to play this role, and here Mrs. Martina began to pose the bread next to the wall, and she lit the candles on the table, and she started repeating some words in low voices and others in high voices. Then the candles started to shake, and everyone saw the shadow of a woman clearly moving behind the table. Everyone felt afraid, but they held on to each other, because Mrs. Martina had warned them all before starting the session that if the circle breaks at the session, the matter will turn completely for the worse. The guard began to shake, and then he began to speak in a voice other than his own. He was speaking in a strange way. Mrs. Martina began to speak to him, or to the spirit that was inhabiting him at this time, and here everyone began to listen to that spirit that said that she was one of the maids who worked in this hotel a while ago. For a long time, one day she found some sweets in an inmate's room, and she felt like she wanted to taste them. At that time, she felt suffocated, numb, and swollen in her face and all of her body, and no one was able to save her, especially since she fell unconscious in the same room, and no one found her until several hours later when the guest returned from the fishing trip. As soon as the hotel staff picked her up, she felt that her soul was connected to this place. She wanted to leave the hotel, but she could not find the way, maybe because she didn't know what happened to her. Mrs. Martina told her that she must have been allergic to one of the candy ingredients. Then Mrs. Martina began giving that lady instructions that clearly appeared as a shadow on the wall opposite the table, specific instructions through which she could find the light. Indeed, after a short time, the maid spirit told us that she had found the light and would now step toward it. The maid spirit thanked Mrs. Martina, and then her shadow disappeared from the wall. Mrs. Martina repeated some words, and the guard returned to consciousness again. And here Mrs. Martina said that the guard must rest for a while because his experience of being the one to whom spirits enter is a physically exhausting experience, and she cannot risk using him again. And here the maid volunteered to do the role. Each of us returned holding the other's hand, and Mrs. Martina began repeating the words again, some loudly and some in a low voice, and here the maid shook, and a shadow appeared on the wall behind her. It was a small shadow, as if it belonged to a teenage boy, and indeed, when the maid began to speak, we recognized her. The spirit inhabiting it is the spirit of a local teenager, and that he was involved in a drowning accident, and since then he feels that his soul is lost, and he wants to see his older brother. And here we all heard the voice of the guard crying, and then he spoke in a weak voice to ask him, "Are you Tom?" The maid answered him in a teenage voice, "I am Tom." And here the guard started crying again, and told the spirit that he was Rick, his brother. And then Tom began to tell him that he missed him very much, and missed his mother and brothers. The security guard, Rick, told him that they thought he had run away when he was a teenager, and despite the police entered to search for him, but they never found him, and that is why the family did not know until now that he had died by drowning in the lake. Then Tom spoke in an excited voice and told Rick that he saw his grandfather pointing to him to go to him. He would go in the direction of the light. Tom asked Rick to. He tells his mother that he loves her and misses her very much. And here Miss Martina again begins to say some words in order to stop the session again. Rick asked us to go for a while, and here Miss Martina told him that there are 4 people besides him, so he can go and the session can continue. Without a problem, everyone felt sympathy for Rick the guard, and so none of us objected to what Miss Martina said. After a short time, we returned again, holding each other's hands, and the receptionist was the one who would receive the spirit this time. Mrs. Martina told us that this was the last spirit inhabiting the inn, but she warned us that this spirit might be the most difficult because it was the spirit of Archibald Grandison, the original owner of the house. So it won't be easy. Indeed, the session began, and Mrs. Martina repeated her words, some of them in a loud voice and others in a whisper, and then the receptionist shook violently, to the point that her hands almost slipped away from us, but we held them tightly. And then the shadow of Mr. Archibald appeared on the wall behind her. The receptionist was speaking in a harsh, angry, threatening voice. "Who brought me here?" Mrs. Martina tried to talk to Mr. Archibald and ask him to go and leave the hotel, but he insisted on staying and told her that he would not go anywhere and would not leave his home because his soul was connected to this place, because he lived there the most beautiful years of his life, and he was not ready to lose all of this now. And then Mrs. Martina told him that Mr. Locke was a good person and took care of the house, but she was afraid that he would leave if Mr. Archibald continued to bother him. Archibald's voice began to shake, and here Martina knew that she could reach a solution that would satisfy everyone if she tried. Martina continued to speaking to Mr. Archibald's spirit and telling him that he needed to agree on a truce between him and Mr. Locke. Mr. Archibald's spirit agreed to the truce in exchange for Mr. Locke making sure every afternoon to play old music that Mr. Archibald liked and leave them in his library. And here, Mr. Locke nodded. Agreeing, Mrs. Martina told the spirit that Mr. Locke agreed and asked him to leave after thanking him. Here, Mrs. Martina ended the session and asked Mr. Locke to maintain his agreement with the spirit of Mr. Archibald. Martina left the hotel, and Mr. Luke was skeptical about what had happened a while ago and considered that everything that had happened was an illusion. Here he thought a little and asked himself, why not try for a week? Then he decides whether it was just an illusion or whether Mrs. Martina actually communicated with Mr. Archibald's spirit, and indeed the next day Mr. Locke made sure to play the music that Mr. Archibald had specified after he searched for it in the library and found it actually as Mr. Archibald said, and indeed since that day, everything calmed down. All the strange phenomena that happened in the hotel and the sounds and things stopped disappearing, but they would happen again if Mr. Locke one day forgot to play the music or small children came to the hotel. It seemed that Mr. Archibald was disturbed by the presence of children, and so he made sure to scare them with some tricks that he learned on the hotel over the years like a wandering spirit in the place. The hotel continued to operate and became one of the most important places for visitors to the lake, and over the years it became the official destination for many horror gatherings held in the state of Minnesota.